Hello, and that is right. We are doing a review of the Samsung 980 Pro. It's an SSD we talked about here on the channel around about a year ago, and in the year since it was released, we have seen so much happen in the SSD industry, particularly PCIe Gen 4. So I did think it was worth revisiting this drive, given we've been talking a lot about this kind of architecture drive over the past 12 months or so. So without further ado, let's run those titles. So for those that aren't aware, the Samsung 980 Pro was one of the first commercially available PCIe Gen 4 SSDs in the market. It wasn't the first, there were a few out there at the time, but it was one of the first 7,000 megabytes per second SSDs out there. PCIe Gen 4 at the closing few months of 2020 had just sort of arrived on the scene, and although it had been around for a little while with a lot of motherboards arriving with M.2 PCIe Gen 4 slots on them, very few SSDs in the market, particularly in the commercial sector or prosumer sector, were able to saturate the potential 8,000 megabytes per second that PCIe Gen 4 x 4 in M2 form was able to provide as bandwidth. And a small contingent of drives managed, despite the pandemic, despite shortages, despite US and China trade wars, despite all of those different factors and environmental ones as well, managed to sneak their products onto the market. And one of them was the Samsung 980 Pro. And even when it launched a year ago, it was still a pretty competitive drive even at that point. Even though there weren't a lot of drives on the market, even the price point wasn't that aggressive. And fast forward 1 year, not only have we seen close to 30 or 40 different mainline PCIe Gen 4 x 4 drives arrive on the market, hitting that 7,000 megs per second bandwidth performance there, that throughput there at the top. But at the same time, they've been creative with the pricing. They've kind of held on to the market in a big way. Samsung, a large in-house SSD manufacturer, managing to not only continue to supply and facilitate that demand, but also get creative with that pricing. To give you a little bit of perspective on that, the drive arriving in 4 different capacities, 250 gig, 500 gig, 1 TB and 2 TB, arrived at $89, $149, $229 and $429 at launch. The majority of those prices now are noticeably lower, and this isn't going to take into account any Black Friday or Prime Day sales or any kind of seasonal sales here. This is kind of the go-to price. That 500 gig knocking around for about $20 less, the 1 TB knocking around for about $30 less, and the 2 TB device there at the end arriving with a lovely drop of about $40 to $50, depending on where you shop around. Obviously, I'm just talking US dollars there. You've got your pounds, you've got your euros, you've got your Australian, Canadian dollars as well. All of those have seen significant dips in that price. So is it, that price drop, is that a question of the device getting a little bit older? Is that them saying that their hardware maybe isn't as cutting edge in 2021 as it was in 2020? Well, it's an argument for both ways, actually, when you look at the architecture, with a little bit of hindsight, of course, but also looking at it right now at the time of recording in November 2021. This SSD arriving with their in-house controller, the Elpis or Ellipsis. I know a lot of people say it in different ways, but let's just call it the Elpis and we'll just agree on that. That controller, that in-house controller, still manages to push out a significant performance there. And again, only the 1 TB and the 2 TB crack the 7,000 megs per second mark, with the 250 and the 500 gig models there around 6,400 to 6,900. And of course, that is sequential read because at launch, it still had an impressive performance for write at launch, but that's one of the few areas that this drive 1 year later does look a little weaker in terms of sequential. So that's big data write. From the 250 all the way up to the 2 TB, we see 2,700 megs, 5,000 megs, 5,000 megs, and 5,100 megs. All good numbers in of themselves within each of the capacities. I hate seagulls, but at the same time, we are seeing a lot of drives arriving at the similar price point to this at the end of 2021 that can do 6,000, 6,800, get the 1 and 2 TB level at a similar price to this. So again, that's one area where 1 year on, I think this drive has maybe shown its age a tiny bit. But going back to that internal architecture, that in-house controller is still pretty darn good. And that is also backed up with one of the earliest examples at its time of a good jump up in its NAND architecture. Of course, it takes advantage of TLC NAND, triple layer cells, but it took advantage of 128 layer NAND there, that 3D NAND. Now that's really important because even now at the end of 2021, it's not the highest NAND layering out there. That goes to the 176 layer from like Micron and I think ADATA as well do a lot of their in-house stuff, and their latest generation arrived with 176 layer NAND. But everyone else is on 96 layer NAND. This drive, a year ago it was released, more than that in some places. This drive has got 128 layer NAND on there, and that really did at the time help it maintain that 7,000 megs very early doors in terms of performance. There are other advantages as well, such as IOPS, that we'll talk about in a bit. But before we go any further, let's actually have a look at this drive. It would be remiss of me also not to highlight that at the beginning of December of this year, there's a new version of this drive coming to the market. Weirdly, it's taken them a year to release a version of this SSD with a heatsink on board. A year. An NVMe SSD in PCIe Gen 4, it took them a year to release a heatsink version. People are asking for it, people are demanding it. One of the earliest questions with this was about what's the right heatsink to buy. But nonetheless, just a long time to wait, and that heatsink isn't even, not very competitively priced. It's about $30 to $50 for that heatsink, depending on the capacity. And of course, we will be looking at the heatsink version of this drive with the latest firmware to see what more we get out of it from that. But still, nonetheless, I'm glad to hear they're producing a heatsink version. Shouldn't have taken a year. So again, we've got the retail packaging there, and we've got the drive itself. This is the 1TB model there. We'll remove that label in just a moment. You can see there it's one-sided. One area that I think does somewhat buckle the performance a little bit, and it's something that's changed a lot over the last 12 months. Because remember, this is a re-review. We're not reviewing this like it's brand new. We've got to take at least some elements of the changing tides of the last 12 months in. And one of the things we've seen, consistently in high performing, particularly in write performance, NVMe SSDs, is that a lot of the 1TB, the 2TB and higher arrive with double-sided NAND. That distribution of the NAND cells allows better performance as that simultaneous read-write action happens. As long as you've got a controller and the right amount of, DRAM, SD-RAM, whatever you want, the system's going to be built with, more NAND chips is always going to be better. And the fact that this goes up to 2TB, they were already hitting 2TB, 2280 length, quite consistently at that point. So I'm kind of surprised that they didn't go down that road to kind of up the performance a little bit. Maybe the controller wouldn't have seen the benefits at that point. I'm not sure. But the 1TB arriving in that fashion, presumably with two 512 gigabit NAND modules inside there. Let's remove that label there. Let's be a little delicate not to damage the drive while we're doing it. Removing that label there carefully from the top, we can take a good long look at that drive. Again, you can have a little look. We've got that LPIS controller there at the top. Very useful indeed. And again, Samsung, much like WD, pretty much do everything in-house, which often means that's how they can be not only great when it comes to stock availability, but also the speed and turnaround of a lot of their units. And of course, cost of production means they can actually be quite, jiggly-pokery about those prices there. Now, in the middle, you can see that memory there on board. And again, scaled depending on the drive you go for. So whether it's 250 and the 500 gig, you get 512 megabytes of memory. That's low power DDR4 memory on board. And the 1TB and the 2TB have got 1 gig and 2 gig respectively inside there. Also, this takes advantage of NVMe 1.3C. At this point, when it was launched, 1.4 wasn't mainstream. So again, that's another area where we've seen a lot of change in the last 12 months there. But it is still PCIe Gen 4x4 in architecture, and we will be testing it in just a few moments on my test machine to see that it's still got it in it. And of course, updating your firmware is going to be pivotal. This is a drive that's seen numerous software updates in its lifetime. By software, I of course mean firmware. So again, we're going to be making sure that the Samsung magician visits this bad boy and make sure that we get that firmware up to date. Now, one area where it's hard to criticise them for, because on the one hand this was a year ago, but it's worth touching on, is to do with durability. This drive arrives with a drive writes per day of 0.3 drive writes per day, so that's 150, 300, 600 and 1200 terabytes respective to each of those capacities. Now, a lot of NVMe 1.4 and PCIe Gen 4 x 4 M.2 SSDs in the market right now. 0.3 to 0.4 is pretty much where everyone's living these days, between 0.3 and 0.38. There's a few notable exceptions like the Patriot, like the Firecuda, that knock around at 0.5 and 0.7 drive writes per day on them, but the bulk of them, they do seemingly arrive at the same durability as this drive. So although I would like to see something higher, you can't really critique this drive for giving the kind of durability now at the end of 2021 that everyone else is giving, despite the fact it's a year older than pretty much everyone else right now. In terms of IOPS, that's an interesting point about this. Yes, the lower capacities, the IOPS, is pretty good, comparable to everyone else at the 250 gigabyte level. It is 500,000 IOPS read and 600,000 IOPS write, and that's 4K IOPS there. But what's really intriguing is even at the 500 gig mark, this manages to crack the 1 million IOPS barrier, with the 500 gig arriving at 800,000 and 1 million IOPS read-write 4K respectively, and then consistently on the 1 and the 2 TB models there at 4K IOPS cracking 1 million in read and write 4K for both of them. So again, great performance there from this drive, and again, a year ago. And we're seeing drives released in the last 3 to 6 months with very similar architecture of this, taking advantage of the Integrit and the Phison controller, and all of those, if they're lucky, they can reach 750, 800,000. So this SSD from a year ago, cracking the 8mm 4K IOPS barrier, is very impressive indeed. But for now, let's get this SSD in our test rig. It's that 11th Gen i5 quad-core processor, 16 gig Windows 10 system. We're going to be utilizing this in the extra expansion drive. We're not going to be using it as an OS drive there. And again, I'll be going through some of the tests that we're going to go there, as well as monitoring temperatures. It's also worth highlighting that we're not utilizing its first-party heatsink. We're going to be using the WD M.2 heatsink, knocked around for about $12 to $15. You've seen it here on the channel. But we will be revisiting a lot of these results in around about a month's time when the heatsink enabled version of this with their first party heatsink included, just to see how they compare. I'm also going to hopefully include in that video a little bit about Samsung Magician to show you guys just how easy it is to update the firmware on this if you are considering this drive at Prime Day, again Black Friday, Cyber Monday, Christmas deals, or basically wondering whether this 1 year old drive is still worth your data. So stick around for the Samsung Magician tool there, because you will find it useful. But otherwise, let's make our way to the test machine. Right, so we've got our Samsung 980 Pro installed on the test machine. You can see there in Crystal Disk, we've got the drive there. We'll just refresh the screen a little bit there. We can see we're connected on a PCIe 4x4 lane, but it's worth highlighting once again that this is a drive that takes advantage of NVMe 1.3. So do bear that in mind. Now, before we go any further into the test, as mentioned earlier on, because a number of you may be buying this drive, quite a while after it was released, in this case more than a year ago, I'm just going to take a quick moment to give a few of you a few tips about when you first install it. I know this is a revisit and kind of a re-review, I get that, so fast forward a few minutes if you're more than aware than this, but a few things straight off the back. The first one is updating the drive's firmware. That's right, this drive here that I ordered and received around about 3 weeks ago, this drive already had firmware that was noticeably out of date. Remember, this drive came out a year ago. So it is recommended to download the Samsung Magician tool in order to update your firmware. So as you can see, we can have a look at it there, and at the bottom left of the screen, we can see an update is available for it. There's my old version of the firmware, there's a new version. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and show you. So when you update the firmware for the first time, it's going to check system compatibility, and it looks like your computer will need to be shut down after this firmware update. This isn't unheard of, although this isn't an OS SSD. I'm using this as a secondary drive, but if it's your OS SSD, I can't stress enough that if you're going to go ahead and update firmware on your drive to get the best performance and stability, then you make sure your data's backed up if it's an OS drive, because sometimes these things can lead to a drive being formatted, so do bear that in mind. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and restart this now and go back to when the system's restarted and carry on and guide you guys through not only the testing, but another little feature about how to add the drive as an extra drive on your system. Okay, so the PC has restarted. As we make our way in, we can see the drive there. We can also go back into the Magician software, and as you can see, we're now running that latest software. Do bear in mind, if you head to Samsung's own website, you can go ahead to the support section and download all of the stuff you're going to need, including that free Magician tool. But while we're on the Samsung page, it's worth just once again remembering what the specifications are of today's drive. We're using the 1 TB model, as we can see here, so we're looking kind of at this range here of sequential read of up to 7,000 megs, sequential write of up to 5,000 megs. We've got the IOPS up to 1 million, and again we're looking at 4K IOPS more than anything, and again that is basically our parameters. Whether we hit these, I'm not sure, because almost certainly these have been bench tested with high-grade Ryzen or Xeon-based processors, something we're not running today. On today's video, we are utilizing the, let's get it up there, an 11th gen i5 6-core processor with 16 gig of memory. It's a Windows 10 Pro system, and we're utilizing this drive as an additional drive. The last thing I want to show you guys before I kind of walk you through the testing, if you are someone that's looking to upgrade a Samsung SSD, or indeed any SSD, or just looking to attach a new drive, I'm just going to walk you through the steps on how to do it, because I know it's not part of the review, but you might find it helpful. On the My Computer section, or the This PC section, go to the top, select Computer, then select Manage. From the admin window that pops up, you need to double click Storage, then double click Disk Management. From here, you should see the drive appear visibly there on screen. As you can see, I've already got the 980 Pro visible to us here. But again, you may not see that there, so I'm just going to delete it so it's right the way back to when you would first see it. Chances are, when you log into this for the very first time, let's switch that to offline. What we can do is put this drive back online and initialize the disk. So, rescanning the disks. When you do come into this window, you may find that the drive in question has a black line there. If you can't see it, right click and the option to initialize the disk should be available there. But otherwise, right click, new simple volume, and then just go through and create your new storage area. Give it a letter, in this case S for me, and then give the drive a name. So in this case, I'm going to call it the Samsung 980 Pro 1 TB. Quick format. Now our drive is added and we can now perform all of our tests, and that should help you. I would recommend doing that if you can upgrade firmware, or just check on the health of your disk. So in today's video, let's get rid of the Magician there. We're going to be doing several things in the testing half of this video. We're going to keep an eye on the temperature of this drive. Even though using that L10 heatsink, I think it's going to be important to keep an eye on just how much heat is being generated during these tests. We're going to focus on 4 main test programs. First one is Crystal Disk. Sorry about the black screen there if you saw that. That's just Windows looking for admin rules. And again, there's our drive, the S drive there. We're going to be running 3 tests on Crystal Disk. We're then also going to run 3 tests on Atto Disk Benchmark. And again, all of these different file sizes. We're then going to use ASSD. ASSD, of course, we can go ahead and load up there. Oh no, that's Anvil. We're not going to use Anvil for this video. We can bring in ASSD there. And again, we're going to do 3 tests with ASSD. And finally, we're going to do 3 tests with AJA, where we're going to be focusing on kind of high hit point kind of read and write activity there, and a good look at the graph, not so much the top numbers. And again, we've done a similar test like this before on numerous SSDs previously, as we can see here. So we'll be looking about how the Samsung SSD compares against a couple of other 1 TB drives. We're going to look at the WD Black and the XPG Gamix throughout this video on a few occasions. And it's also worth highlighting we are using screen recording software here, so I am going to stop the screen recording shortly so we can conduct the test, because it will utilize an element of CPU and GPU resources in order to do it. Just to put that into perspective, if we right click there and have a look at performance, we can already see that even now we're utilizing quite a lot of hardware just to do screen recording without any tests. So I'm going to conduct all the tests with a 1 minute gap between each test. So should take a little under an hour, and then we'll come back and go through all of the results and hopefully decide whether the Samsung 980 Pro is still worth your money and your data 1 year after release. Let's go. Right, so our barrage of tests have completed, and I'm pleased to say that the temperature on this SSD wasn't actually half bad. I've got to go through that right now. Let's get that up on screen. At the very highest point, and this was during the 4 gigabyte Atto disk benchmark test there, we can see that it reached only as high as 53. Now, of course, we were using that Elatang heatsink, and we will be revisiting this test later on at a later date when the Samsung 980 Pro arrives in December 2021 with that first-party heatsink. But already that was quite a good temperature there, and even during the idle. Although one thing I will say, again, more about the Elatang than about the Samsung, it didn't do a fantastic job of dissipating that heat as much as I would have liked. These are still good and well within workable parameters, but still nonetheless it would have been nicer to see a quicker drop down in terms of that temperature. But overall, very, very good indeed. Now, so the first thing we'll look at there is crystal disk. We'll get that up there on screen. As you can see, one of the things that I was a little sad about, we didn't break the 7,000 megs barrier on this SSD. Now, arguably, as mentioned, I'm not going to be I haven't been utilizing a high-end Xeon or kind of Ryzen 7, 8 or 12 core processor, but I have been able to hit 7,000 megs previously, such as with the Gamix series. I was able to break the 7,000 mark relatively easily, as you can see there. And again, this is an SSD that arrives at arguably the same price point here as that of this Samsung here indeed. So although the IOPS there are unquestionably fantastic there, hitting 1 million comfortably in every single instance in terms of 4K read IOPS, and around about 0.5 mil there on write IOPS, which again does still work mostly within the parameters stated by Samsung themselves, although I'm not too sure about those read IOPS there, I've got to say. Those write IOPS, I should say. In terms of overall performance, I'm happy with it, although slightly less than I would have liked, given I've got the latest firmware on this machine. The mixed performance was pretty good, although arguably right now the Samsung 980, although it is a good SSD, and I would still largely, give it a good boost. I've got to say I'm a little underwhelmed there by that write performance. Again, something that, as mentioned in the intro, is something that I think is feeling noticeably the oldest in the 1 year that's passed since this drive was first released. So if we come out of the crystal disk sequential read, we can go into something a little bit more analytical. We can make our way into Atto disk benchmark utilizing that drive. And on Atto disk benchmark, of course, Atto disk benchmark utilizes numerous I/O file sizes and different overall test file sizes all the way for its test, as you can see there in read and write and traditional throughput. Now, we'll compare this against another drive that came out a very, very similar time, and that is, of course, that of the WD Black SN850. So if we compare the 1 gig versus the 1 gig there, we can see between the two of them that overall that WD Black did seem to get a higher read performance figure throughout the course of those testing. But and again, even on write, the WD Black was high. Now, yes, that WD Black had its own first-party heatsink, but I don't think that would have made enough of a difference. Still great numbers for the price point, and considering how not so much lucrative, but how creative Samsung have been with their pricing, particularly during Prime Day, Black Friday and the like. But I do think that the write performance, I would have liked to have seen it get a little closer to 5 gigabytes than it did, and it also didn't crack 6 gigabytes as much as I would have liked in some of the earlier IOs than I would have expected. Now in IOPS, unsurprisingly, it absolutely dominates. If we look at any of these other SSDs, Let's look at another 1TB SSD down here. So if we take a quick look at the, let's go with the Gamix again actually, because that's probably the best example. And we look at the figures for IOPS there, we can see even at the 1 gig level there, it just absolutely trounced it in terms of what it was doing there. The Samsung still an incredible job in terms of overall I/O performance there at the top, and that does extend all the way down to the biggest and the largest file sizes as well. So if we look at the 4 gig there, we can see between the two of them that the performance there on the ADATA Gamix paled in IOPS at this same file size and I/O level compared with that of the Samsung 980 Pro. So coming away from Atto this benchmark there, we can make our way into SSD, again a stricter tool. Normally you see performance figures utilizing their presets around about 10 to 12% lower than you do in Crystal Disk. Luckily we always utilize the same parameters for our testing. So again, what we'll do is we'll go back into WD Black there and we'll bring up not so much IOPS, let's go for read-write performance. So at the 1 gig level we can definitely see that overall the WD Black was the high performer of the two there. And again, that did seem to indicate, even if we make our way into the IOPS there, and with the IOPS figure between them, that WD Black in the same test machine a short while apart, it was just overall the higher scoring drive between the two of them. That said, if we move away from the WD Black series there and go to something like the Crucial series, another brand that takes advantage of a lot of in-house development, and we look at those IOPS compared there, yes, we are looking at a 500 gig versus a 1TB, which has to be bared in mind, but in terms of IOPS, that generally wouldn't have that much of an impact at this level, at least at the 1 gig file, and the Samsung absolutely destroying it there. Indeed, because all three testing there, switching that back onto throughput, the performance was pretty respectable, but again, maybe looking a little bit off the mark now, fast forwarding, and something I think maybe a high-end heatsink would add a little tiny bit more performance, but not crucially like massive amount of throughput difference between these two drives. Now, coming out of that, we can make our way into the final one, which is AJA. Now, AJA, for those that aren't aware, this is one where we don't look at the big numbers because it's just not a fair way to judge SSDs, but we did run 3 tests here on screen. You can see we've got a 1 gig, a 4 gig, and a 16 gigabyte test file. Consistently high performance, all the way along, barely any dips in between. Just to put that into a little perspective, if we have a look at the WD Red SN700 and have a look at its performance, that is an example there of a drive where it was getting oversaturated way too easily there. But the performance figures there, pretty respectable for what we would like to see for a drive at this level. Let's have a look at the Titanium Micro now as a basis of comparison. So let's ditch that. Titanium Micro here fires on E18 SSD that was released some 8 months after this one. So we'll compare the 1 gig file there between the two of them. I can try and fit that all on the same screen. So if we have a look at them above one another, we can see that the Titanium did manage to get higher playback and captures than that of that Samsung. So again, some of these SSDs, these young upstarts that have appeared in the last year or so, do seem to be taking advantage, particularly of Phison and its great innovation, and Integrate as well. But again, the Samsung 980 Pro maybe is not ruling the roost as much as it once did, and I do think although it's still a solid performing SSD there, it maybe could do with a little bit of a refresh. And you know, if you do see it on offer this Black Friday or Prime Day, you could do a lot worse. Certainly in utility, when we've done it in our PS5 testing, it's still in the high ranks of them. It's not the highest grade SSD I would recommend for PS5 utilization, but I will say that given the flexibility of the pricing you're seeing at the moment against that of the performance that the drive is reported to have in high intent situations, particularly what we saw in terms of IOP performance, it's still a contender and a great SSD 1 year on. Just know that in the last at least 6 months, if not the last 8 months, there have been other SSDs arriving on the market that, although more expensive when compared to discount prices on the Samsung SSD. If you compare them RP for RP, then they're very similar indeed. But this has been reviewing the Samsung 980 Pro 1 year later. Still recommend it, give it a look, but know there's better stuff out there right now. If you've enjoyed this, click like, and if you did, it helps me by you clicking that button so I can make the next video better than the last. If you enjoyed this but want to learn more about not just this SSD but other SSDs and the subject of storage and networking in general, click subscribe and the bell to be notified about future content. We make a video every day and we cover many subjects. And finally, if you do want to ask any questions or aren't too sure about what your storage needs are, take advantage of the free advice section over on NAS Compares. Completely free, linked in the description. It's manned by two humans, me and Eddie. We answer every inquiry. It might take us an extra day or so because they do get quite busy, but we answer every one and we genuinely do nothing with your email. Just click the button down there to take you through to there. But otherwise, I will see you next time.